My question, what is the nexus between Donald Trump, Kevin Samuels, and Donnie Depp? Hello, one and all. Mucho gusto. This is the 84th edition of the Gabby Mac Project. Let me interrupt your scheduled programming for a few minutes. I think pretty much everyone will agree that the past several years have been interesting to observe. Now, why is that, you may ask? Well, it's been interesting to watch feminists as they try to regain some of the momentum they've enjoyed for the past 50 to 60 years. The democracy is under assault. They realize that they are losing their grip on America. And it's about time. In fact, it's long overdue. You see, feminists and their allies in the media have been able to control the narrative for far too long. They have shaped, managed, and controlled the cultural narrative in American life for far too long. They have wanted to believe that men and women are the same. We are not. But let's walk down memory lane, shall we? Let's be clear. As a black man, I have never been a feminist, and I think that most heterosexual men have not been. Or are they in the feminist camp? But to be fair, we can say that when the first wave feminism started in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, it was pretty hard to argue against their belief that every American, both men and women, should have the right to vote, to own property, etc. But you see, after having gained those rights, feminists shifted the focus in the 1960s to economic and reproductive rights, the right to terminate pregnancies at will, etc. And it was during this second wave of feminism that divisions began to surface within the movement. You see, conservative, traditional women began saying that they were going too far. So they parted ways with these feminists. And even within the feminist movement itself, there were the liberal feminist wing who wanted to focus on the rights of women as individuals, while another sector of the feminist movement, the so-called radical feminists, believed that aligning themselves with the gay liberation movement better suited their political agenda. These quote-unquote radical feminists aligned themselves with revolutionary groups and lesbian resistance movements. You see, radical feminists call for the reordering of society in which male supremacy is abolished in all social and economic situations. Now, some people argue that these radical ideas caused the outward backlash against feminism in the 1980s. In fact, a term called quote-unquote post-feminism came into being as a backlash against feminism. And it was aimed at reclaiming traditional gender roles in an attempt to subvert feminism. Nevertheless, feminists continued to push their agenda. So in the 1990s, the third wave of feminism focused its effort on quote-unquote gender equality and quote-unquote social justice for all oppressed groups. Now, in 2012, the fourth wave of feminism began with the mission of using social media to concentrate on issues such as sexual harassment and violence against women. It was around this time that people were really beginning to tire of feminism. And in 2015, Time magazine released a poll asking whether the feminists should be banned from our vocabularies because the word had lost its nuance and power. But true to form, they received such pushback from the feminist movement that the magazine had to issue an policy. Issuing a policy for something that was so obvious. And it was during that same year that Women Against Feminism shared photos of themselves holding that stated why they didn't need feminism. Now, in the 1980s, men did try to fight back, but to be most honest, their efforts were drowned out simply by being called chauvinistic. So men pretty much had no voice. And that's too bad, because all they were trying to do was tell men to not be afraid of being a man. In fact, it was men who coined the term toxic masculinity. But somehow, women were able to turn that phrase upside down and make it mean something that was demeaning toward men. Now let's fast forward to 2015. Donald Trump came on the scene, and with his no-nonsense, very public display of his masculinity, was very attractive to both men and traditional women. And sure enough, he was able to win the presidency. Trump made being a man's man cool again. But beyond that, his push for conservative policies endeared him to a very large number of Americans. And of course, some people, liberals, were really upset about his crowning achievement. And that was to put 3 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. And recent history is showing us that with the apparent repealing of Roe versus Wade, Trump cemented his legacy. Now, during that same period, another movement was coming onto the scene, and it was the Black Manosphere. Their goal was to reclaim their voices in the Black community, and their messages resonated with a large contingent of Black men and some women. And for 7 years, the movement grew and grew. But with every successful movement, there has to be a person who leads them in the battle. And in this case, it was the ascension of Mr. Kevin Samuels, who was able to galvanize the disparate legions of men and women. You see, Mr. Samuels presented himself as an unapologetic Black man. And his messages pretty much focus on reinvigorating the Black family, which in turn would improve the Black community. Now, Mr. Samuels presented a persona that resonated with Black men and women, like Trump. Mr. Samuels never shied away from controversial issues or the tough circumstances in the Black community. And because there was so much observable truth in his crusade, he attracted legions of supporters. He too was a man. And now let's get on to Johnny Depp. Now, I don't think Johnny Depp is a supporter of the men's movement, but because of his celebrity and the ensuing attention that his defamation trial had, he was able to show on a worldwide stage some of the ills that had been fostered on the country by feminists and the Me Too movement. Johnny Depp became a metaphor to show how a man could be defamed and canceled just by an allegation. Now, what his trial put on showcase was the silliness of believing a woman just because she was a woman. Now, unlike Mr. Depp, most men don't have the platform to fight the Me Too movement. And what his trial showcased to the world was that, yeah, sometimes men are falsely accused of DV. And not only men, but many females watched the court proceedings and were able to come to their own conclusions. And generally, most people began to question the knee-jerk response that said, "Believe all women no matter what," unquote. So, we owe Johnny Depp's a bit of thanks. Now, looking at the United States from 40,000 feet above, I believe the United States is undergoing a course correction. But, it's like trying to turn around a battleship. The process is slow, but it is happening. The stranglehold that feminists have had is loosening. And like I said before, Roe versus Wade is an important example. Now, it's going to take some time because most of the mainstream media is aligned with the feminist ideology. So they have a huge say-so in how arguments are framed and presented to the public. But in the American streets and through social media, people with contrary opinions now have alternative outlets to get their messages out there. I'm talking about people with traditional values and mores. It's no more a silent majority. Gabby Mack, OUT. Now you can go back to your regularly scheduled programming.